As we approach Holocaust Memorial Day, it's particularly poignant to be in the library at Leo Baeck College. The college itself was founded by refugees from Nazi Europe, and the library too has its roots with those refugees. Our first librarian, Jenny Dorfler, was a refugee from Nazi Europe, and the first books that came to the library had also suffered at the hands of the Nazis and were saved. As we are particularly marking the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz concentration camp, we've been having a look at some of our material about Auschwitz and the Holocaust more broadly. First thing I wanted to share with you is really two books about Lucy Egglesberger. She was a researcher and she was given the opportunity for a job at Harvard in America, and she didn't take it in the early 40s. She stayed behind to look after her patients and her ailing mother. In 1943, she was interned in the Auschwitz concentration camp, where she practiced as a doctor, looking after especially the female inmates. She wrote a biography in the 60s, which was translated into English in the 90s, and this is the English version, and it has some of those very, very striking photographs of the gates of Auschwitz, which has become symbolic of the deaths. One of the reasons she's also an interesting figure is that a short biography, has been published by Hendrich and Hendrich, who are a German Jewish publisher publishing today with the revived Jewish community in Berlin, and they're particularly profiling Jewish women in their miniature series. So very interesting, that journey and that publishing history. An area that isn't covered so readily is the connection of the Sephardi Jews to the Holocaust, and this is a recent publication by Isaac and Rosemary Levy, looking at communities from Athens, Belgrade, as far as Morocco, and what's fascinating is actually how many of those Jews also ended up at Auschwitz, and they look particularly at how coming from a Sephardi background impacted the experience of internees in the camps. A story you don't often hear when the emphasis is often on Polish Jews and German Jews in the context of the Holocaust. Moving away from history, there are two very interesting works of post-Holocaust theology, one by Ignaz Maybaum, who himself was a refugee from Nazi Europe, and one by Melissa Raphael, this one from the 60s, this one from the early 2000s, both teachers here at Leo Baeck College, and their titles that focus on the face of God at Auschwitz in different ways really show how that concentration camp has become a symbol of suffering and the Holocaust more broadly. And it's interesting how particularly that feeds into reform theology, progressive theology, that both these two teachers have been engaging with. But the power of that idea of Auschwitz, sometimes as a symbol, sometimes means that the wider story of the Holocaust isn't told, and of the Second World War, and of the people who suffered in many different ways. And Dan Stone's recent introduction to the Holocaust and Unfinished History, and one of the things it tries to do is show that concentration camps, and Auschwitz in particular, weren't the only places, sadly, that people were killed and in terrible ways. And he tries to destroy some of our assumptions and looks particularly at this idea that the history of the Holocaust, as his title indicates, is never finished. It's too big, it's too complex. It's not just one genocide, it's multiple genocides. It's a terrible phrase to say, but he explores that not just using dry historical documents, but personal testimony and a really interesting kind of new approach to what is now over 80 years of history. This is a very interesting publication brought out by the Daily Mail in 1945 called Lest We Forget, and it's actually a compilation of some of their news coverage and photographs of the liberation of the camps. I'm not going to turn to those pages now, it's quite harrowing material, but that the editors at the time felt that there was a need to share this in book format with an audience and to engage with some of the British politics at the end of the war, to share, what they call the most shocking images ever seen. And what they do is they link the articles that they quote, they refer you to page numbers where you can see the photographic evidence of these terrible, terrible crimes. It's quite a chilling thing to see even now, and very interesting to think about in the context of Dan Stone's book, where he talks about how the more we know about the Holocaust, the more it's actually exploited for political purposes, and the more some of that violence, he uses the word banalised, but those images are still very shocking. I'll end on a hopefully more hopeful note with this little book, which is a fascinating and very powerful document. It's a collection of drawings by a Polish artist who was interned in Auschwitz, and some of the drawings were made in displaced persons camps in 1946, just after the war, and some of them made later in the 50s from memory. And this was published by the museum that's at the Auschwitz site in the early 60s. And he does a remarkable thing. He's trying to give a sense of what a day in the life of the camps was like. And what he does is they have these fold-out pages where on one side you have women's camp and on one side the men's camp. And this particular image is called Return from Work and shows those famous, notorious orchestras that played as the inmates went to and from their slave labour. This was his personal experience, and this was what he wanted to document. What I will close with, though, is a moment from, I think, those displaced persons camps, and it is called Friendship's Worth, and shows two camp inmates in those familiar striped, almost pyjamas, offering some food to possibly a dying friend or someone in great need. And the fact that those acts of kindness are still possible in a hellish landscape, I find heartening, and hope that these sorts of commemorations and the material we have here in the library help us not only to analyse the past but use it to move forward positively.